Tonight. Well, in just over 2 weeks, the state legislature will reconvene in Albany. But as of today, we actually only know 61 of the 62 state senators who will be showing up that day. The race out in Nassau County between incumbent Democrat Craig Johnson and Republican Jack Martins remains tied up in legal challenges. Now, yesterday, a panel of 4 appellate judges upheld a lower court ruling that denied Johnson's request for a full hand recount and handed his seat to Martins. Today, Johnson said he plans to appeal, taking his case all the way to the state's highest court. My next guest says she supports that decision. Susan Lerner is the executive director of Common Cause New York. She says that much more is at stake here than just one Senate race. Susan, thanks for your time tonight.
Happy to be here, Liz.
So you really feel, Common Cause really feels, that this isn't about one guy. It's not about the balance of power in the Senate, which arguably would be changed because it would actually be deadlocked if for some reason the Democrats managed to pull out a victory here. You say it's about setting a precedent going forward with the new voting machines.
Absolutely. We have adopted a new system in New York, and Common Cause and our coalition partners argued vigorously for a system that has paper ballots. And the reason why we argued for paper ballots is for exactly this situation, that when you have a very, very close race, you can go to the paper ballots and recount them. So having a system that uses paper ballots and not bothering to do a full manual recount is like equipping your car with seat belts and just never bothering to use them at all.
Okay, but it's actually the law to put your seatbelt on, but we don't have any law dealing with these new voting machines, right? I mean, we just don't have anything. We have a lot of election law cases that dealt with the old machines, but because we've never used these before, it's sort of uncharted territory.
Well, yes and no, in the sense that our law puts a tremendous amount of discretion in a place where, frankly, Common Cause New York doesn't feel it should be, and that's in the hands of the trial judge. And you'll remember Common Cause was one of the named plaintiffs in a case called Lopez-Torres, where we challenged the way in which trial judges were chosen because it was an anti-democratic, small d democratic process that allowed party insiders to choose judges. So we have yet another aspect of our election system here in New York that's gamed by political insiders because it's up to a judge to decide whether or not to have a recount. In 11 states, it's statistics, it's numbers. If you have a very close margin, the way you do in this Martins-Johnson race, then it's automatic. It's not a question of discretion. It shouldn't be whether a judge feels like it or not, whether a board of elections wants to bother or not. If it's really close, the voters need to know that every vote has been accurately counted, and you do that with a manual recount when you have paper ballots.
You know, you bring up a really fascinating point that's actually in the news at the national level right now, and that's the political affiliations and connections of judges, because there's a big question as to, for example, the healthcare reform law and the judge who ruled that a piece of it was unconstitutional and his connections to a GOP consulting firm. I mean, people should remember, I think is what you're pointing out, that judges are political beings, that they are elected or appointed by politicians, and subsequently we're talking about politics within politics when it's a judge ruling on a race.
And, you know, I think that's a whole other show, and I'd love to come back and talk about judicial independence, which I think is a really important issue. But what we're talking about here is that we have a clear alternative where it really doesn't matter whose discretion it is. This shouldn't be discretionary. You have a race that's decided on less than half a percentage point difference, then you ought to go to a manual recount, period. End of story. Pretty easy to understand.
Okay.
It's not statistics.
Here's the point, though. You say, in a statement, that New Yorkers should not be forced to accept a possibly flawed election result for the sake of speed or convenience. The problem is that Governor-elect Andrew Cuomo actually asked the Chief Judge, Jonathan Lippman, for an expedited calendar because he is concerned that the Senate is going to be dysfunctional, and that's going to hamper his ability to get his agenda through that chamber. And we have seen months of dysfunction in that chamber, so we know that they know how to do it.
Well, here's the thing, Liz. I think you need to make a distinction. There should be, and appropriately, the Attorney General can ask the courts to expedite the legal issues. But that has nothing to do with how much time it might or might not take to do a hand recount. If a hand recount were to happen, it could have been accomplished long ago. Expert testimonies in this case said that you could do a hand recount in perhaps 4 days, no more than a week. And how much time have we spent in the courts? This is full employment. Our election law is full employment for election lawyers. It's election lawyers and judges deciding our elections, not the voters. It's time to get back to what elections should be about, which is who do the voters choose? And it's the voters in New York's election system who are the forgotten people, and that's simply wrong.
Well, we are going to find out, obviously, because Craig Johnson, as I mentioned, says that he is going to appeal this decision. In the meantime, I wanted to talk to you about another sort of semi-related issue, which is redistricting, another hot-button reform issue. You have been involved in this for a while. Now, the Senate Democrats are holding hearings on redistricting, which I find a little curious because it looks like they are about to lose the chamber, of course, based on this Johnson-Martin's race. You think it's a good idea for them to plow ahead with this anyway?
Absolutely, because what's a hearing for? A hearing is to give members of the public an opportunity to air their views, to make them known to members of the legislature, and to get them on the public record. The one thing that we really desperately need in this state on virtually every single issue is a good and vigorous public discussion of what's actually at stake. So here, for instance, on Tuesday in New York City, it was really interesting to hear what the South Asian community had to say about the way in which their community in Queens had been cracked between 5 or 7 different assembly districts, and how, as a result, their community didn't have any voting strength because they were separated from each other. That is definitely the kind of discussion which the public should be aware of, and hearings are a good way to let the public know.
You know, 3 of the 4 legislative leaders in Albany have actually signed, Hold on.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
I didn't hear you.
Okay. 3 of the 4 legislative leaders have actually signed that New York Uprising pledge for Independent Redistricting Commission, which was something that former New York Mayor Ed Koch was pushing. So Shelley Silver is the only one who didn't sign it. The entire Republican conference signed it. It looks like they're going to take the majority. Do you really believe that they are going to be able to let go of the one thing that might keep them in power for another, I don't know, decade or so?
Well, I think it's up to you, Liz, and to us in the public and the advocates to hold them to their word. I think it's difficult for anybody to let go of power. I understand how tempting it is to be able to jigger your own re-employment for your own advantage, but it's simply not right to do so. They've signed the pledge. We should hold them to the pledge, and just as important as having an independent commission process is the criteria that are used. We need to be sure that any map that's drawn, no matter who draws it, respects the voting rights of minorities and does not set up a system that favors incumbents and particular political parties. That's really the key, and that's what we need to see happen.
From the perspective, though, of minority rights, I mean, aren't those protected from the at the federal level?
They are indeed, but any system that we set up in the state has to recognize that and deal with it fairly. And to us at Common Cause, incumbency protection is really the biggest problem that we see. And we're forming an independent commission to look at what the legislature does to advise the new governor as to whether any particular process or any particular bill or maps that are presented to him have this fatal flaw, which is incumbent protection in it.
Susan, just in parting, we have seen now, within the span of a single month, 2 senators go down, Vincent Liebel and Pedro Espada. More corruption at the Capitol, more charges coming down. And yet, it doesn't seem, every time we have all these editorial boards and we have good government groups saying, this time, this should be a lesson, heed this and reform. And yet, do you really think that this time is going to be the time? I feel like I keep asking this question.
Well, you know, Liz, it's really hard to figure out how much more alarming it could get than the situation that we have. Liebel, Espada, it has no party limits. It is an equal opportunity corruption, and it is exactly what turns the voters off. And what we hear from individuals is that they are really grabbing their senators, their assembly members, in the dry cleaners, in the supermarket, and saying, what is with you guys? Why can't you be honest? Why can't you? I know you're honest, but why can't you clean up the system? So I think it's hitting a boiling point, and the real question is, are we going to get a strong bill? Is Andrew Cuomo going to be able to negotiate real reform, or are we going to see a bill that has some changes but not really enough to be a significant grab hold and clean up the situation, which is how we felt about the bill that passed last January?
Well, one more thing on Andrew Cuomo's to-do list. We will be talking to you again, I'm sure. In the meantime, Susan Lerner, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.